Before Steel Magnolias ever reached a movie screen, it was a one-act play performed in a tiny off-Broadway theater, and the man who wrote it based every single character on real people from his own family and hometown in Louisiana. Robert Harling wrote the play in just 10 days as a way of grieving his sister Susan, who died from complications of type 1 diabetes in 1985. What began as a private act of mourning became one of the most beloved American films of the 1980s. A story about 6 women whose friendship, humor, and heartbreak have stayed with audiences for more than 3 decades. But behind the warmth and laughter on screen, there were casting battles, near misses, creative gambles, and real grief woven into every scene. Let's start counting down. Number 15. The play that wrote itself in 10 days most Hollywood films take years to develop from initial idea to finished screenplay. Steel Magnolias took the opposite path. Robert Harling wrote the original stage play in roughly 10 days in 1986, pouring his grief over his sister Susan's death directly onto the page. Susan Harling Robinson had struggled with type 1 diabetes for years and died in 1985 at the age of 33, leaving behind a husband and 2 children. Harling later said in interviews that writing was not a calculated creative decision, it was more like emotional survival. He needed somewhere to put the pain, and the characters came quickly because they were all drawn from real life. The beauty salon where the story takes place was modeled on the actual shop run by his mother's friend in Natchitoches, Louisiana. The women in the play were composites and direct portraits of the real women who had surrounded his family during Susan's illness and death. The play opened off-Broadway in 1987 at the Doublepaw Theater and was an immediate critical and audience success. It transferred quickly and attracted serious Hollywood attention. The speed of its creation gives the finished film a rare quality. The emotional rawness that audiences responded to so deeply was not engineered through development meetings. It came from genuine, unmediated grief, and that authenticity radiates through every scene. Number 14. A southern town that played itself many Hollywood productions promise authenticity and then quietly relocate to a studio backlot. Steel Magnolias did something genuinely unusual. The production filmed almost entirely in the real town that inspired the story, Natchitoches, Louisiana, which is the oldest permanent settlement in the Louisiana Purchase Territory. Director Herbert Ross and producer Ray Stark made the decision early that filming on location was essential to the film's emotional truth. The actual town square, local homes, and genuine Louisiana landscapes appear throughout the picture. The exterior of Truvy's beauty salon was constructed on a real street in Natchitoches, and the interiors were built on a soundstage that closely matched the surrounding architecture. The production's arrival brought significant economic activity to a community that was not accustomed to major Hollywood shoots. Local residents were hired as extras, and many real Natchitoches locations appear without disguise. Robert Harling, who grew up nearby in Cloutierville, was deeply involved throughout production, and the presence of the real town clearly shaped the film's unhurried, intimate rhythm. Filming in a small southern town in summer also created genuine production challenges. The heat was intense, and logistics that would be routine in Los Angeles required considerable ingenuity on the streets of Louisiana. But the filmmakers believed the authenticity of the location was worth every inconvenience, and looking at the finished film, it is difficult to argue otherwise. Number 13. The role Dolly Parton almost didn't take, Dolly Parton, was not the first person that every studio executive imagined when they thought about the role of Truvy Jones, the warm and witty beauty salon owner at the heart of the story. Parton was, at that point in her career, primarily known as a country music superstar and had appeared in a handful of films, most notably 9 to 5 in 1980 and The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas in 1982. But Parton was genuinely drawn to the project. She later discussed in interviews how much she connected with Truvy's humor and her deep loyalty to the women around her. There were also reports that the ensemble nature of the project appealed to her. This was not a vehicle built around a single star. but a story that required 6 performers of equal commitment. Producer Ray Stark had assembled an extraordinarily ambitious cast, and Parton's involvement helped signal to other performers that this was a project worth joining. Her natural warmth and easy comic timing translated beautifully to the role. Many of Truvey's most quoted lines, delivered with Parton's characteristic cheerfulness, became defining moments of the film. It is also worth noting that Parton did not simply coast on personality. She studied the character and found real emotional layers beneath Truvey's relentless optimism. The moments when Truvey's good humor strains against harder realities are some of Parton's finest screen work, and they suggest how much untapped dramatic range she brought to the project. Number 12. Why Sally Field Fought, for Malin Sally Field, received a Best Actress Academy Award nomination for her performance as Malin Eatonton, the mother at the center of Steel Magnolias. But what is less commonly discussed is how strongly she wanted the role, and how personally connected she felt to the material before filming even began. Field has spoken in various interviews about the fact that she was deeply moved by the story of a mother watching her child suffer from a terminal illness. She was also aware that Malin's emotional journey, maintaining composure and dignity right up to the moment she shatters completely, was the kind of demanding interior performance that serious dramatic actors spend careers searching for. The scene in the cemetery, where Malin breaks down and then is gently pulled back by her friends' shared laughter, is frequently cited as one of the most powerful sequences in American cinema of the 1980s. Field's performance in that scene reportedly moved the entire crew to tears during filming. What audiences may not realize is that the scene was shot multiple times from multiple angles over the course of a full shooting day, and Field committed completely to every take. Director Herbert Ross allowed Field considerable creative input into how Malin's grief was expressed. The result is a portrait of maternal love and loss that remains raw and recognizable decades later. The Academy nomination was well-deserved, and many observers still feel it represented her finest screen performance. Number 11. Olympia Dukakis won an Oscar the same year Steel Magnolias was released. 1989 was an extraordinary year at the Academy Awards for its cast members. Olympia Dukakis had won the Best Supporting Actress Oscar in 1988 for Moonstruck. But the timing created an interesting dynamic on the Steel Magnolias set. Shirley MacLaine, who plays the sharp-tongued Ouiser Boudreaux in the film, was herself an Oscar winner. She had taken Best Actress for Terms of Endearment in 1984. The cast also included Dolly Parton, Sally Field, a 2-time Oscar winner at that point, and Olympia Dukakis. Then there was Daryl Hannah and a young actress named Julia Roberts making a film that would change her life entirely. The concentration of talent and awards recognition in a single ensemble created a set that was simultaneously collegial and intensely professional. Multiple interviews and behind-the-scenes accounts describe the atmosphere among the women as genuinely warm and collaborative, but with an undercurrent of shared ambition that pushed everyone's performance upward. MacLaine, in particular, has spoken about how much she enjoyed playing a character so different from her usual screen persona. Brittle, funny, and profoundly loyal beneath her abrasive surface. The dynamic between her character and Dukakis's Clary, frenemies who clearly adore each other, required an instinctive comic chemistry that the two performers developed quickly and to remarkable effect. Number 10. Julia Roberts in the role that launched everything. It would be difficult to overstate how significantly Steel Magnolias changed Julia Roberts' career. When she was cast as Shelby Eatonton Latchery, the young diabetic bride whose health deteriorates throughout the film, Roberts was largely unknown. She had appeared in Mystic Pizza in 1988, but she was not yet a household name. The Steel Magnolias audition process was competitive, and Roberts won the role by impressing both director Herbert Ross and producer Ray Stark, with her ability to balance Shelby's radiant optimism against the shadow of her illness. Roberts was in her early 20s at the time, and the role required her to hold her own against some of the most experienced actresses working in American film. She did more than hold her own. Roberts received an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress for her performance, her first Oscar nomination, and she lost to Brenda Fricker for My Left Foot. But the nomination, combined with the film's enormous commercial success, positioned her for what came next. Within months of Steel Magnolias' release, she was filming Pretty Woman, which opened in 1990 and made her one of the biggest stars on the planet. The role of Shelby required Roberts to portray both physical decline and fierce emotional defiance. Her work in the hospital scenes and her quiet scenes with Sally Field demonstrated a dramatic depth that the industry had not yet fully recognized, and Steel Magnolias was the film that made them pay attention. Number 9. Shirley MacLaine's Armadillo Surprise, one of the most memorable set pieces in Steel Magnolias, is the armadillo groom's cake that appears at Shelby's wedding reception. The cake, shaped like a gray armadillo with red velvet interior meant to represent its internal organs, is a moment of pure Southern Gothic comedy that has become one of the film's most quoted and reproduced images. The armadillo cake was not an invention of the filmmakers. It was based on a real cake that was served at Robert Harling's sister's wedding in Louisiana. The detail was so specific and so genuinely strange that Harling included it in the original play, knowing it would read as authentic precisely because no one would think to invent something so peculiar. For the film, the production design team created a prop cake that could withstand filming and still produce the visual payoff of the red velvet interior when sliced. The scene where Ouiser and Clary enthusiastically consume the armadillo's hindquarters, with MacLaine and Dukakis delivering their lines with completely deadpan commitment, was reportedly a joy to film. MacLaine has described how much she relished Ouiser's complete indifference to social convention. Eating the rear end of an armadillo-shaped cake without a moment's hesitation is a perfect encapsulation of the character's personality, and the scene remains one of the most quoted in the film. It also illustrates something important about the screenplay. The funniest moments are grounded in genuine Southern life, not manufactured eccentricity. Number 8. The budget. The gamble and the box office Steel Magnolias was produced on a budget of approximately $18 million, a modest figure even by late 1980s standards for a major studio production with a cast of this caliber. The fact that the film could be made at that cost speaks partly to the relatively contained story and partly to the fact that ensemble films driven by performance rather than spectacle are inherently more economical. TriStar Pictures released the film in November of 1989, a period that was becoming increasingly competitive at the box office. The studio's marketing focused heavily on the ensemble cast and on the emotional power of the story, a smart strategy that targeted women audiences who were demonstrably underserved by Hollywood's action-dominated release calendar of the period. The gamble paid off spectacularly. Steel Magnolias ultimately earned approximately $83 million at the domestic box office alone, making it one of the most profitable films of the year relative to its production cost. International performance pushed the total considerably higher. For a character-driven drama with no special effects, no action sequences, and a story centered almost entirely on the interior lives of women, that return was remarkable. The film's commercial success had a genuine, if modest, influence on how Hollywood evaluated women-centered ensemble dramas in the early 1990s. It demonstrated that audiences would turn out in enormous numbers for this kind of story if it was told with quality and care. Number 7. Herbert Ross and the Challenge of Intimacy at Scale. Herbert Ross was an experienced and highly regarded director when he took on Steel Magnolias. His previous credits included The Goodbye Girl, Footloose, The Turning Point, and Pennies from Heaven, a varied filmography that demonstrated his range. But Steel Magnolias presented a specific directorial challenge that set it apart from most of his previous work. The story takes place primarily in a single interior space, Truvy's beauty salon, with 6 principal characters whose relationships shift and deepen over the course of several years. The challenge was how to keep an essentially theatrical, dialogue-driven story visually engaging on film without opening it up so much that it lost its intimate quality. Ross's solution was to trust his cast almost completely. Rather than using elaborate camera movement or visual spectacle to sustain audience attention, he focused his technical energy on capturing the precise emotional truth of each scene. The camera work in Steel Magnolias is understated and purposeful. It serves the performances rather than competing with them. Ross also understood that the ensemble dynamic required careful management. With 6 strong performers, each protecting the integrity of their character, the director's job was partly diplomatic, ensuring that no single performance overwhelmed the balance of the group. By most accounts, he succeeded, and the resulting film feels like a genuine community of women rather than a collection of individual star turns sharing the same frame. Number 6. The grief behind Shelby's diagnosis. Robert Harling has been consistent and open over the years about the autobiographical roots of Steel Magnolias, but the depth of that personal connection deserves careful attention. His sister Susan was diagnosed with juvenile diabetes and was told by her doctors that pregnancy would place her life at serious risk. She chose to have a child anyway, a decision that her family supported but also feared. The parallel to Shelby's story in the film is direct and intentional. Harling was not dramatizing a general truth about illness and family. He was reconstructing, as faithfully as he could through the medium of drama, what had actually happened to his sister and to the people who loved her. Susan's death affected Harling profoundly and permanently. He has spoken in interviews about how the play was an attempt to preserve her spirit, her humor, her stubbornness, her love for her family, in a form that would outlast his own private memory of her. The character of Shelby is not a version of Susan. She is, as Harling has described it, his effort to give his sister a kind of immortality. This biographical foundation explains something that audiences often sense but cannot quite articulate when they watch the film. The grief in Steel Magnolias does not feel performed. It feels experienced. That distinction is what separates the film from lesser productions that attempt similar emotional territory, and it begins with the simple fact that the man who wrote it had already lived through everything on screen. Number 5. The cemetery scene. One of cinema's great performances, the scene in the Natchitoches Cemetery following Shelby's funeral, is the emotional center of the entire film, and it has been analyzed and celebrated by critics, film scholars, and ordinary viewers for more than 30 years. It is worth examining carefully, because what appears on screen represents an extraordinary convergence of writing, direction, and performance. MacLaine, surrounded by her friends after burying her daughter, begins to speak with quiet composure. And then, the composure breaks, completely and catastrophically. Sally Field's delivery of the speech that begins with the words about being so angry is by any reasonable measure one of the finest pieces of screen acting in American film of the 1980s. The transition from grief to rage to exhaustion, all within a few minutes, is technically and emotionally demanding in a way that few scenes in any film attempt. What follows, Clary offering Ouiser to MacLaine as a punching bag, and the group's collective collapse into grief-soaked laughter, requires the entire ensemble to shift emotional registers simultaneously. The fact that it works is remarkable. Director Herbert Ross paced the scene carefully and reportedly allowed the actresses significant freedom in how they responded to Field's breakdown. The scene was written by Robert Harling, largely as it appears in the original play. The film added the specific location and visual context of the cemetery, but the architecture of the scene, grief transmuted into laughter. Community, as the only real answer to loss, came directly from the stage. It remains one of the most emotionally honest sequences in Hollywood cinema. Number 4. The music that set the tone. The score for Steel Magnolias was composed by Georges Delerue, a French composer with an extraordinary career that stretched back to his collaboration with François Truffaut in the 1960s. By the time he scored Steel Magnolias, Delerue had worked on dozens of major American and European productions and was widely regarded as one of the finest film composers of his generation. Delarue's approach to Steel Magnolias was characteristically understated. rather than overwhelming the emotional scenes with swelling orchestral drama. He created a score that felt like a natural extension of the Louisiana landscape, warm, slightly melancholy, rooted in the specific atmosphere of the American South. The main theme is deceptively simple, built around a melodic line that can shift quickly between warmth and sadness depending on the context in which it appears. This tonal flexibility was essential to a film that moves rapidly between comedy and grief. A more conventionally emotional score would have signaled to audiences too clearly when to laugh and when to cry, which would have undermined the film's core insight that laughter and grief are not opposites, but constant companions. Delarue died in 1992, just 3 years after Steel Magnolias was released. Steel Magnolias is considered among his finest American scores, and it demonstrates that the quiet, human dimensions of a film's emotional life can be served as powerfully by restraint as by grandeur. Number 3. What Happened to the Real People. Robert Harling based his characters so directly on real people that the relationship between the film and its biographical sources is unusually close. After Steel Magnolias became a cultural phenomenon, those real people and the family of Susan Harling Robinson had to navigate a particular kind of public attention. Susan's mother, Margot Harling, was the model for Malin. Her experiences of watching her daughter decline, of maintaining strength for the family, and of the grief that followed Susan's death were translated almost directly into the script. Harling has spoken about discussing the play and film with his family and ensuring that they were comfortable with how their private experiences were being shared with the world. The real beauty salon owner who inspired the character of Truvy, Harling's mother's friend, was reportedly pleased and moved by the affectionate portrait. The Natchitoches community that appeared in the film embraced the production and continues to celebrate its connection to the story decades later. The town has hosted Steel Magnolias tourism for years, and locations associated with the film remain points of local pride. What makes this biographical dimension unusual is how completely the real people recognize themselves in the fictional versions. Harling's achievement was to honor their experiences while simultaneously creating characters that felt universal to audiences who had no connection to Louisiana, to Susan's story, or to any of the specific details that inspired the film. Number 2. The audition that changed Julia Roberts' life. The story of how Julia Roberts came to be cast as Shelby involves a detail that is not widely remembered but that shaped the film significantly. Herbert Ross and Ray Stark saw a large number of young actresses for the role. Roberts was relatively unknown at the time, and her primary advantage in the audition process was something that could not be taught or manufactured. When Roberts read for the role, she reportedly did something that struck Ross immediately. She did not play Shelby's illness. She played Shelby's determination to be alive, to be present, to refuse the identity of a sick person even as her body declined. This was exactly the quality that Harling had written into the character and that the film required. Someone whose vitality made her death devastating precisely because it seemed so impossible. Roberts has said in various interviews that she understood Shelby intuitively. The character's insistence on living fully despite the danger she was in, having a child, maintaining her joy, refusing to be diminished by her diagnosis, connected with something in Roberts's own understanding of how people actually live with fear. The audition convinced Ross that Roberts could hold her own against Sally Field in their shared scenes that required a young, relatively inexperienced actress to match a 2-time Oscar winner in moments of real dramatic intensity. The fact that she did so, and that those scenes between mother and daughter are among the film's most powerful, is a testament to both performers. But it began with an audition that correctly identified what the role actually required. Number 1. The 10 days that became 35 years of legacy. The most important and perhaps most moving fact about Steel Magnolias is also the most straightforward one. A man in grief sat down and wrote a play in 10 days because his sister had died, and 35 years later, the film adapted from that play is still bringing comfort to people who are grieving. That chain of events private loss becoming public art, becoming shared human experience, is not common in Hollywood. Most films are commercial products developed through elaborate systems of notes, test screenings, and market research. Steel Magnolias began as one person's desperate need to process something unbearable, and that origin is inseparable from everything the film became. Susan Harling Robinson died in 1985. She never saw the play. She never saw the film. She never saw Julia Roberts crying in a cemetery, or Dolly Parton delivering her lines with that particular luminous warmth, or Shirley MacLaine eating the back end of an armadillo cake. And yet the whole film is, in the most direct possible sense, her story, her life, her courage, her refusal to be reduced by her illness, her death, and the way the people who loved her kept living afterward. Robert Harling gave his sister a form of permanence that very few people achieve. Audiences who watched Steel Magnolias in 1989 and who have watched it repeatedly since are, without necessarily knowing it, spending time with a woman who died in a Louisiana hospital at the age of 33 and finding in her story something that speaks to their own losses, their own fears, and their own capacity to survive them through the company of people they love. That is what great films do. And it is why this one endures. What these 15 stories reveal, taken together, is that Steel Magnolias succeeded not despite its personal origins, but entirely because of them. A real woman's life, a real family's grief, a real town's community, and a playwright's 10 days of desperate writing, these are the materials from which a lasting film was built. The actresses who brought it to life understood what was being asked of them, and they delivered something that continues to matter. More than 3 decades after its release, Steel Magnolias is still being discovered by new audiences, still being quoted, still making people laugh and cry within minutes of each other, which is exactly what Robert Harling intended. If these stories added something to your understanding of a film you love, leave a comment below and let us know which fact surprised you most. And if you'd like more deep dives into classic films like this one, please subscribe. There is plenty more to come.